California, he told me.
He's in California? Oh my goodness. Yeah. Okay. Great. I actually put it on my file. See, it says record button. But thank you, because I probably would have just not noticed it anyway, even though it's big and green. All right, so we're going to just jump right in here. The topic of today is how can we lead a meaningful life in the face of constant change and uncertainty? And so just to give a quick recap for those of you who may have missed the previous sessions, we've been talking about the Buddha's teachings centered around the Four Noble Truths, which form the heart of his teachings. The Four Noble Truths were taught at Deer Park in Varanasi. And the first is that all life in cyclic existence is suffering. So that's the truth of suffering. The second is there is a cause of this suffering, namely craving caused by ignorance. The third is there is a release from suffering. And the fourth is the path to the release from suffering can be understood as the Eightfold Buddhist path, sometimes known as the Eightfold Noble Path, right? The Buddhist path of right view, right concentration, right mindfulness, right speech, right effort, right action, right morality, and right livelihood. And we've been talking also about some of the four key Buddhist philosophical views that are woven into the very fabric of the Four Truths. And so the first we've been saying is all compounded things are impermanent. So everything that depends on causes and conditions is impermanent. That can also be translated as all that is conditioned is impermanent. So all conditioned things are impermanent. The second is that all emotions are painful, whether they seem pleasant or not, they're still painful. That can also be translated as all that is tainted, contaminated, is suffering. The third is that all phenomena are empty and devoid of self. Also translated as all phenomena are empty, they are without inherent existence. And the last is that nirvana is beyond extremes. The state of liberation is beyond the extremes. Or I think it's a little easier to understand it as being translated simply as nirvana. That state of liberation is peace. So we've been looking at how, ordinarily our basic assumption as we go about our daily lives is that things exist as solid, independent entities, right? That they have some kind of objective existence. They're sort of out there, right, external to us. And we are not always aware, we don't recognize that all phenomena, including ourselves, arise as a result of, an infinite variety of causes and conditions. And they all come together because of our own past, actions, right? So that idea of karma is very, very important to really understand, to really take the time to study. And we touched on it a little bit, in the last class. But for the same reason that things come into existence, come into production as a result of all of these causes and conditions, which we can't fully understand. By the same token, they're also destroyed, right? They pass out of existence when these causes and conditions that were supporting them come to an end. Right? So emotions such as craving and hatred and pride, we went through some of the different root afflictions and the 20 secondary afflictions in the last class. And they all stem from, when you try to identify the root cause, it's this mistaken view, which I just talked about. So it's known as ignorance, right? It's an ignorance of how things exist, right? So we're kind of duped by these false appearances. And so one of the main central themes of Buddhism is that we have been helplessly under the control of these two forces, right, of karma and negative afflictions for countless, lifetimes, since beginningless time. Over and over again, we've been under the control of karma and the negative emotions. And in response to those powerful forces, we act out of self-grasping, sort of like an innate self-grasping, self-cherishing, and that sort of primal instinct, so to speak, right? That's what causes us to engage in actions that harm others, right? Because we see this, chasm, this great difference between ourselves being like over here and others being external to us, being out there, right? And so as out of this instinct of self-preservation and me, myself, I, and mine being the most important thing in the world, then that's what causes us to kill and eat, our fellow living beings without a second thought. Right? We casually lie, we tell lies without maybe even realizing that we're lying. We cheat, we steal. We falsely accuse somebody of doing something that we did. If we're really irritated or again, we're not being sensitive, we may say something on social media to accuse somebody, and that can have, very, very long-term damaging results. So our actions create unlimited negative karma that leads to great suffering, both in this life and future lives. And we talked about how even, a very small, what seems like a very minor negative action that harms somebody, if it's not purified, if you don't confess and purify it, that negative energy will continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. And then likewise, if we do something to help others, right, then the same positive, in this case, the positive energy will continue to increase and grow and grow and grow. And so our aspiration is to continue that, of course, to continue to grow the positive energy as much as we can, to make sure that we don't lose, that we don't destroy all of this, what is known in Buddhism as merit or virtue, right? So it's like you're creating all these positive imprints. But you need to guard and protect that by, how would that be lost? What would you think?
Well, through karmic actions.
Right. So if you do the opposite, exactly. So you've created all of that beautiful stock of virtue, but then if you get angry, if you do the opposite, if you harm the people, harm living beings, then everything that you've so carefully accumulated, just gets destroyed. One instant of anger and countless lifetimes of virtue are destroyed. And so when we talk about the cornerstones of the Buddha's thought, then it's the Four Noble Truths, it's these four philosophical views that we just went through, right? And then the last one, of course, is taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, right? Taking refuge in the Buddha as, the teacher, the Buddha's teachings, known as the Dharma, right? And then the Sangha being the spiritual community of teachers and friends. that support us on this journey, on this path. So in today's session, we're going to be looking particularly at the topic of impermanence and death. And these are subjects that, of course, we often, are reluctant to think about because they make us uncomfortable and they can bring up painful feelings of grief and sorrow and loss, right? But by familiarizing ourselves with these topics over and over again, by meditating on the inevitability of karma, of karmic caused death, right? This is actually the best way to help us prepare for death's arrival, right? So by preparing for it, then it helps us, appreciate, right, every moment of our lives. Right? If you know that death, in the end, to our existence can come at any time, then we're more careful, right? We're more careful about how we use our time. Somehow it makes the preciousness even more precious, so to speak. It also helps us in another very important way, which is when we realize that what we have in common with other living beings is our fragility, is our vulnerability in terms of not knowing how long we have to be together. Then it helps to really forge those bonds, to really develop love and compassion, and knowing that we're all in this situation together. And as we sit in meditation, these reflections really form a very strong basis for our ability to concentrate, for our ability to develop that sense of connection, that sense of striving to help all beings escape from this cycle of old age, birth, old age, sickness, and death, right? So all that is conditioned is impermanent, right? This is what we're talking about. So impermanence and suffering, right? They go hand in hand. And here we're talking in terms of like the Buddha's overall scope of teachings, the path to enlightenment, right? That's what we're talking about, a path to enlightenment. And it's the teachings are very, very carefully laid out in stages, right? And so here, this topic of impermanence and death is considered one of the topics, and then suffering in general, which is what we're going to talk about right now. All of these topics form the core teachings for beings of what's known as sort of like the small scope or the intermediate scope. The translation's kind of weird, right? But people who are just like us, like beginners, just kind of starting out on the path. These are the topics that we should reflect on in our meditation, every day, right? So then the teachings for students of the great scope, so to speak, right? Those are the teachings on the mind of enlightenment, right? Bodhicitta. And we'll talk about that more in the final class, right? So that's what we'll be talking about, the relationship between cultivating love and compassion and its relationship with wisdom. And we'll talk more about the trainings and the practices that somebody who is aspiring to become, a Buddha, what are the specific types of activities that such a person should be engage in. But right now, we need to understand these core foundation teachings before we can really understand why and how to become a practitioner of the Great Scope. So the teachings describe 8 kinds of suffering. So some that the 4 that we just mentioned quickly. So birth, old age, sickness, and death. Right? Those are sufferings that are part and parcel of being born in the desire realm. And then the next is the suffering of encountering the unpleasant. The next is the suffering of separating from the pleasant. So getting things that you don't want, and then having to give up all the good things that you just got. The suffering of not getting what you want at all, right? So let's say you want to win the lottery, but you don't win the lottery. And then the final one is the suffering of the appropriating aggregates. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in greater detail in a minute, what that means. But basically, the suffering of, in the case of a human being, like having a body and mind. So these 8 kinds of suffering are also condensed, explained, as 6 kinds of suffering. And then they're also, in their most condensed form, they're described in terms of 3 types of suffering. Okay. And so as we go through the 3 in greater detail, you'll see how they relate to this classification in terms of 8. So all right. So just quickly, the 8 again, excuse me, were birth, old age, sickness, and death, encountering the unpleasant experiences, separating from pleasant experiences, not getting what you want, and then the suffering of the appropriating aggregates, right? Having the body and the mind. So in order to understand this, we need to take a look at this idea of feelings, right? So feelings are can be of 3 types. So, and they can be related to the body or, to the mind. So feelings related to the body can be unpleasant, like you're feeling cold or you're feeling too hot. They can be pleasant, you're having a delicious cup of tea. That's a pleasant sensation of the body, or neutral. And then likewise, in relation to that, there are the mental feelings of what we would call mental happiness, mental unhappiness, and then just sort of neutral feelings. So maybe like the mental feelings of, okay, so mental happiness, what's an example of mental happiness? Ice cream. Okay, right. So maybe it's the physical sensation would be like the bodily feeling of pleasant experience, and then the mental happiness could be maybe all the mental associations associated with going to the ice cream parlor and like go with friends, right? Okay. So the point is that when we talk about suffering, right, we need to be careful to identify both the physical and the mental aspects associated with that, experience, right? So it's the entire body-mind continuum, as well as like all of the objects, all the phenomena that are enwrapped in that experience as a whole, right? That's the suffering. It's not just like one little aspect of that. It's the whole enchilada. And all of that goes together to produce either, a painful or a pleasant experience. And the point is that these 3 general types of feelings, right? So feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, those, give rise to the next step then. First, you've got that, what we're defining in a very limited way as feelings, right? So these feelings then give rise to ignorance, attachment, and anger, the three poisons. Okay. So all of this, comes together in a really interesting way. So then it gets even more interesting, right? Because I said that there's three kinds of suffering, right? That all of this is condensed into, starting with the 8, which we just went through twice, right? The 8 can then be summarized into these three kinds of suffering. And since, this is a very short course, we're going to talk only about the 3. But, please, if you have time, you go back and read these, investigate this more and more. And it's just, you're reading it and you're thinking, yeah, that's right. That's me. That's everybody. Okay, so the 3 are, let me just rattle them off and I'll go back through them and take a closer look at them. The first is, no big surprise, the suffering of change, right? We're talking about this, we're talking about impermanence and death, right? So suffering of change. The second is the suffering of suffering, or the suffering of pain. That's the easiest to understand. And then the third, which is the most difficult to understand because it's the hardest to identify and recognize, is known as pervasive suffering, or the suffering of conditionality. Things being, related to causes and conditions, or pervasive suffering. Okay. So all of these 3 are, closely related to each other. The suffering of change, this is easy to understand. So it's described, well, actually, this is a good way to start, I think. The commentary by Geshe Sopo Rinpoche, he talks about, or he uses the analogy of a painful open wound. Okay, so the fact that we're born, as living beings in the desire realm, in being in this state of samsara, is compared to being a painful open wound. So the suffering of change, and so this theme goes through all 3 types of suffering. So starting with the suffering of change, then the fact that we are a painful open wound. When we're come into contact, with some cool, pure, refreshing water, right? If you have a wound and you put some cool water on it, then in some cases that can make you feel much better, right? So that pain is temporarily alleviated, and that temporary alleviation of pain is what we understand to be pleasure, right? So it's a temporary release from pressure, from pain. And so it's a pleasant feeling combined with, mental happiness, and it's a temporary lessening of pain. The problem being that it's a temporary alleviation of pain, and it's not, in any way an abiding, stable source of pleasure, right? And so eventually, that pleasure then, since this is a suffering of change, right, then that pleasure changes into the suffering of pain, or the suffering of suffering, the second of the 3 sufferings, right? And so, for example, if you go on a wonderful vacation with your friends and family, right, that's it seems like, and it is a very pleasant experience. But then eventually, you have to go back to work, right? You have to go back to the office. And so that pleasure reverts back to what it was all the time, all along, right? And so another way of thinking about this is when we think of our friends, our relationships with our friends, we would like to think that those relationships are stable and will never change, right? But we know that oftentimes friends become enemies, but likewise, enemies become friends. So anyway, the point is that this is a suffering of change, that it's a painful open wound that is temporarily soothed by cool water. We mistake this for pleasure, right? So that change then brings us to the suffering of suffering, or the suffering of pain. So again, that would just be the unpleasant feeling and the mental unhappiness associated with being a painful open wound that is irritated by salt water, right? So it's that increase in pain. Then the pervasive suffering, or as includes both pleasant and unpleasant feelings, but also neutral feelings, right? And so it's the condition of being a big open wound in general, right? So just being a big open wound, being, vulnerable and subject to the impermanence, that pervades all of our experiences of body and mind, right? That's why it's called pervasive suffering. So it's the suffering of conditioned existence as a whole, right? So that's why it's so important to really stop and reflect and think about it. Pervasive suffering is every moment, of our existence is one of suffering. So this can be understood in terms of negative tendencies, right? So negative tendencies is the potential that we have in terms of our karma and afflictions to experience suffering, right? So this includes neutral feelings because they're also the result of karmic actions. And again, the point is that, it's not just, feelings being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, but to think that, pervasive suffering means that our entire mind and body continuum, everything that we're experiencing, and everything that accompanies, the feelings just being one aspect of this body-mind continuum. All of this, all that we are carries the potential for future suffering. So in that sense, pervasive suffering is really the root or the core underlying the suffering of change and the suffering of suffering. So Geshe Sopa uses this definition of negative tendencies again being karma and the afflictions. And the appropriating aggregates, which is the term that I used, in the beginning. So appropriating aggregates is again that the mind and body complex, or the mind and body continuum. And what's interesting about that term, appropriating has that sense of something, reaching out and grasping something and holding on to it. So it's that tendency then to hold on to the things, of the present, right? And then to grasp after things of the future, right? So we're holding on to things of the present, and at the same time reaching out and grasping on to the future. And so how do we do that? What are these different aggregates? Let's review those. So the first of them is form, right? So the body, feeling or sensations is the second, which we just looked at, 3 different aspects of feelings. The third is perception. Perception is also translated as cognition or discernment, that ability to identify different phenomena. The fourth is the hardest to understand, I think. Well, it's formations. Sometimes it's translated as formations. It's the factors for how the mind perceives and apprehends objects, right? So the mind is, in Buddhism, it's divided into different, 6 different kinds of root minds, and then all these 52, 51 mental factors. But basically what it boils down to is how the mind perceives and apprehends objects. It includes the virtuous mental states as well as the destructive, emotions, okay? So those are your the formations. And then finally, we've got consciousness. So consciousness is, there's a sense consciousness related to each of the 5 sense faculties, right? Your eye has a eye sense consciousness associated with it. Your ear has an ear sense consciousness associated with it. So that when you see something, right, there's that moment of bare perception, but then that is just that information, right, is fed back into an associated consciousness, an associated sense consciousness, that then processes it, right? And so you have the 5 sense consciousnesses, and then a mental consciousness. Okay, so these appropriating aggregates, this is the body and mind. Very, very important, basic concept in Buddhism, right? So forms, feelings, perception, formations, and consciousness. So what's the problem? It's not really a problem, but the thing is that because we possess the 5 appropriating aggregates, right? These are essentially the collections, can be understood as a collection of the cause of suffering, right? Then definitely, kind of like by definition, we're going to experience, misery. So no matter what, whether we're rich, whether we're poor, whatever our situation is, because we have, these 5 aggregates, we have this particular body-mind continuum, right? Because we know that, it's pervaded by suffering, then we're all in this together, right? We're all in the same situation. So any comments, questions so far before we move on? Now we've got more people online than we have in the room. So now we have 12 people online and 4 people in the room.
How does Buddhism address the subconscious states?
I don't think they're called out like specifically. I haven't seen teachings because it's. I mean, we would talk about things that we do that we're not consciously aware of. There's a lot of something that you're not being mindful about, that your mind is not detecting through your practice of mindfulness and introspection, right? And they're often, like in the Shantideva teachings, Shantideva talked about Bakme, but the importance of tracking both at a gross and a more subtle level what, I was going to say traffic, but what's going on in the mind, maybe like that. Does that help?
A little bit, yeah. And it's just because I have patients that I put into twilight anesthesia, and I see another person come out during that period of time. I didn't believe in hypnosis at all before I started practicing medicine, and then once I had a conscious sedation, I began to see, this is actually a thing, because then when they came out of the conscious sedation, no recollection whatsoever of what was going on. And the personality was a little bit different. Ambien, another drug that we use for sleep, causes them to have completely complex behaviors like driving and all that sort of stuff. The person who is normally there isn't there, someone else is. And the recollection, they act differently, they speak differently.
Wow.
It's just, it's very interesting. I mean, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it. I've had people in India that I would say that with people when I see that for.
And you can tell that it's not a side effect of the medication, of the treatment.
Correct, yes.
Yeah, interesting.
It is more than just a removal of short-term memory. It is it's a different person.
Interesting.
Some are good, some are bad, some are in terms of whatever, some are loud, some are quiet. That sort of stuff. It is definitely a different person that is appearing and interacting with the world in a different way. I'm just wondering how Buddhism, if Buddhism even addressed that issue, or how they thought about that.
I don't know. I'd have to think about that. David?
Yeah. Is there Buddhist language and concept specifically that recognizes that some of the root of suffering goes beyond our conscious sense of something, like we are bound by the five senses, right? And we tend to define the realities that we experience based on those five senses. However, right now, like there are radio waves that are in the room. There are things that we cannot see,
absolutely,
that we cannot feel, we cannot sense, but they still exist.
Sure.
And so a lot of our realities and our responses to things tend to be bound just by those five senses. But if we allow for the fact that there are these other things that are coexisting, I'm wondering if there's Buddhist language and thought that would help us to understand that there are other factors involved other than what we feel, hear, touch, see, taste, that is also present when we are suffering. There's something else operating well beyond our consciousness.
Yeah.
I'm probably not doing as good a job as I can in explaining that, but just something that goes beyond the limits of our senses that can explain the roots of suffering, or help to frame the roots of suffering.
Well, I think maybe there are two ways of addressing that. So maybe one, in terms of our sensitivity to things that we can't ordinarily perceive with our physical sense faculties. Maybe at a gross level we can't, but maybe at a more subtle level, the fact that the Wi-Fi is around us, or like you said, there would be other types of communication signals around us that we don't pick up on. Maybe at a very subtle level, they are still impacting us. And maybe somebody who's very highly realized, because a teacher once told me this. He said, if you brought in a yogi who's very, very highly realized, very, very sensitive with those heightened sensory perceptions, they could experience things that we ordinarily can't, right? And so there are the stories of yogis who are able to fly across the room and this and that, right? Things that, in terms of our understanding of our physical capabilities, limitations, seem impossible, seem miraculous, but through meditative concentration and purification, then those physical limitations, ordinary physical limitations, can be overcome. So, and in terms of like the root of suffering, right? I think that's what you were asking. Then the root of suffering would not be always comes down to the ignorance, attachment, the root afflictions, being tied again to mistaken view, the view that says that we're limited by our physical abilities or, yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, it does.
A little bit.
It does, yeah. I'm always thinking about things like this. I earn my living as a psychologist.
I know I've got two of you guys in the room, right? I'm in trouble.
It's
No, I'm not a psychologist, I'm just a psycho. He's the psychologist, I'm the psycho.
Oh, no, that's a good question. Anybody online, you can either unmute or send me use the chat feature. I am paying attention here. Otherwise, we'll keep going because we got quite a bit to
Can
go.
I add one comment to this, because it's very interesting to me, because I used to be working in acid before in Connecticut, and did a lot of stuff with a lot of weird things. But interestingly enough, for most of the mathematics of current physics to work, there are a minimum of 11 dimensions as in string theory, and up to 26 or possibly even more in Losang string theory. And that's just dimensions where we perceive four, the space, time, continuum.
Fascinating.
But it doesn't work in the math unless you have at least 11 and possibly up to 26. Additionally, it is, again, for the mathematics to work, 96% of matter is dark matter that we can't perceive. And that's including all the universes, and if you look at the new telescope, pictures of billions of galaxies out there, that's still only 4% of the matter in the universe.
Oh my God. Well, that's humbling.
We cannot perceive it. So your question of limitations, I take now to at least a order of magnitude greater in the universe, and it's very humbling, obviously. Yeah.
Well, and when people start, asking questions about, like, we didn't talk about this too much, but the different realms, right? And they say, there's a hell realm, and the gods and the demigods. I'm like, does the hell realm really exist? Where is it? Like, well, there are things out there that we don't know about, but just keep the door open.
Again, exactly. That's the thing about paranormals. Everybody, the scientists, poo-poo the paranormals, but the scientists need to understand that they are working correctly within their limits, but their limits are showing us that there are not more than other limits that exist. And it's a little bit more difficult for me to just brush that off as a non-reality or just a delusion of some sort. Just because we don't know enough.
Right. Stay tuned.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we're moving on here. So we're talking about mental and physical suffering, and accepting that that's part of life. And so I wanted to just take a little bit of a closer look at this idea of worry and anxiety, right? So here we are in the 21st century, which, if we had to characterize it, worry and anxiety are unfortunately very much, ingrained in not just American culture, but, starting to spread all over the world, I think, particularly as a result of course, of the experience of COVID. But there seems to be, sort of like this generalized anxiety. It's chronic anxiety and pessimism. And one way of thinking about it is that it results from this sense of self-grasping or self-cherishing, and not being able to see how this sort of egocentric perspective traps us or limits us in negative habits. We talked earlier about negative tendencies in a very specific sense, but let's just talk about it, maybe in a general sense, negative habits that we repeat often unconsciously to relieve the pressure of unpleasant emotions. And I think this tendency is often tied to our own expectations of what our lives should be like. We tend to compare ourselves with others, right? And so, my sense of self-worth and how I think of, who I am often comes down to my sense of my relationships, with others. And so it may be helpful to recognize, the pattern that underlies, a lot of our thinking, which is, that of some kind of a trigger that gives rise to prompts a behavior, which then causes some kind of a result. So in a very, in a simplistic way, right? That's sort of the way we tend to operate. Some kind of a trigger gives rise to a behavior, which gives rise to a result. And I think the point for bringing this up is that a lot of time, I can only speak for myself, but I realize that most of the time I'm on autopilot. And so I'm going through these little patterns without being particularly mindful. And so I tend to just respond to these impermanent needs or demands, these feelings giving rise to emotions, right? And if you're not careful, right, then oftentimes, I can find that oftentimes that can be self-destructive. So if we go, with this assumption that the origin here is this sense of self-centeredness, then the trigger, let's say, maybe is feeling lonely or feeling depressed. And then the resulting behavior, if I'm not careful, it could be, whatever, going shopping online or binge eating or scrolling through social media posts, for that little dopamine hit, right? So I'm looking for all these happy dog rescue stories or whatever it is. And then the result is, a temporary alleviation of pain, right? A temporary sense of pleasure, like, because I'm distracting myself from the underlying pain. So likewise, oftentimes, we're worried about or sorrowful about the past, right? And we're anxious about the future. Right? So that's another scenario. And so, maybe the trigger specifically could be worrying about the threat of a recession, not having enough money, and inflation, right? And so the behavior might be, I need to get a second job, right? Or I need to switch jobs, or I need to hope that I'm not sacked, right? That I don't lose my current job, right? And as a result of that behavior of taking those actions, we might actually feel, more stressed, more tired because of everything that's involved in those actions, right? So the point is that by just being able to recognize this pattern and taking steps to work with ourselves, overcoming the sense of self-cherishing, then we can turn the situation around. So by taking the first step of recognizing, on a moment-to-moment basis, that type of thinking, then that's what we need to be able to transform, to discard these old negative ways of thinking, and instead to focus on creating habits that allow us to find joy in helping others. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit here. So in terms of impermanence, though, believing that things are permanent, such as, all of the pleasures, the things that we like in life, our good friends, etc. Having that maybe subconscious expectation that they will continue to be with us is what gives rise to disappointment and despair when those relationships end. On the other hand, unpleasant experiences seem permanent, right? They seem like they'll never end. So for example, when you're recovering from an illness, or an injury, It can seem to just go on for forever and ever and ever. So our sense of self also seems, permanent. This is what we've been talking about. That sense of self seems so permanent. It seems like the person who we were, yesterday must indeed be exactly the same as the person who we are now. And we know when we stop and think about it that that's really not the case. That both physically and mentally we're actually completely different, right? So it's only on a very superficial level that we can assume that we're the same. There's that, appearance of being the same. But in actuality, that's just not the case. Right? And so, let's take a quick look at this idea of change, right? And then we're going to move on to the next topic, which is death. So how to change, and I'm going to read a quote that I've read many times in other classes, but it's such a great quote, I wanted to read it again. So this is by Tendrol Rinpoche. It's from his book, It's Up to You, The Practice of Self-Reflection on the Buddhist Path. And he writes, the possibility of change exposes our love affair with ourselves. And no matter how painful that relationship has been, we may suddenly question our ability to change. Most of us like ourselves very much. We're somewhat addicted to being who we think we are. Maybe we could just keep it that way. The idea of change feels like being unfaithful to ourselves. So we resist change and become illogically stubborn about holding on to habitual patterns. So the point is that, we don't often move outside of our, comfort bubble, right? We have this like comfort zone, unless the pain gets really bad, right? We like ourselves. We're proud of ourselves. So the joke is that no one comes to Dharma class, unless they're going through very tough times, right? And the weather is bad. So the point, though, is that, remember, we've been talking about the Four Noble Truths, right? And we definitely can extinguish these fiery flames, the fiery fire of suffering, right? We don't have to experience pervasive suffering. So true superficial renunciation, we have to be careful to understand this, right? So superficial renunciation would be trying to get out of a temporary, bad situation, right? Like being stuck in a traffic jam on the highway, right? That's superficial renunciation says, oh my God, this is terrible. So that's just searching for relief from a temporary, very limited situation, like limited to today, tomorrow, this life, okay? A temporary relief from pain. But true renunciation, right? True renunciation is turning our backs on suffering, pervasive suffering, the suffering, the suffering of change, right? The whole realm of samsaric suffering forever, right? Forever. So it's a huge, huge difference, right? Huge difference in terms of the scope, the commitment, and the motivation, right? So how do we do this? How do we change? So from the Buddhist perspective, right? No surprise, right? We follow the path that the Buddha laid out, the Eightfold Noble Path, right? And that includes, practicing ethical conduct. That's really the core foundation. Practicing ethical conduct, meaning refraining from harming others, cultivating, a mind that is engaged 24/7 in virtue, right? And then actively helping others. And so to do this, we need to watch our thoughts, and to be mindful and respectful of how we interact with others, how we impact others. So by being vigilant, that enables us, by practicing this ethical conduct, ethical behavior, by being vigilant, then we can catch, even the slightest harmful, evil thought before it manifests as an insult or a crude joke or worse. And so since our thoughts are always and feelings are in constant motion, they're completely impermanent, right? So there's always something to be watching, right? And so we should intentionally nurture and support our positive thoughts by dwelling on them, being giving them our focused attention whenever they arise. Really nurturing and giving them our appreciation. Right? And so we're rejoicing in our own virtue, and that capacity then enables us to also rejoice in the virtuous actions of those around us, right? So instead of feeling jealous, like when somebody else does something good, then by being aware of your own virtue, then you're, I think, able to have that connection with others. Like, I'm trying hard. Wow, you're doing the same thing. You're thinking about others. That's a connection, right? That's like, wow, very, very strong. So at the same time, it's good to be open to receiving the kindness and generosity of others, without in any way like second guessing their intentions or thinking that in some way we're undeserving, right? If somebody wants to give you a gift, somebody wants to take care of you, then be thankful and grateful and really enjoy it, right? Accept that gift. Sometimes that's not so easy, but so when we experience an anxiety about death or sickness, or a loss of prosperity, we should check to see if that reaction, is habitual. It may feel normal to automatically go into this, kind of tailspin of anxiety and worry, right? And it's something that we've rehearsed, right? To the point that it can become just a habitual response, right? And then you notice that perhaps you're reacting in that way. You've developed that habit partly because everybody around you, is doing the same thing, and so if one person worries, then the people around in his or her circle tend to start to worry, and there's like a ripple effect, right? So now the whole society, the whole culture is worried. That's our first line of response, is to worry and panic. And so then, if you're hanging out with people who are not anxious in the face of even a small problem, right? If they don't get anxious, if they don't start automatically over planning and thinking, oh my God, I'm going to do this, right? If they don't have the response, then, sometimes it feels like, what's going on, right? You feel like maybe I am wrong, or maybe they're wrong, or some, it just feel like, it may feel like there's a disconnect. Okay. So when loneliness or anxiety or grief, or remorse, when those feelings overwhelm us, then we need to, there are different ways to respond, right? And so one of the techniques, meditation techniques that has been shared and has proven to be very effective, I think, is known as RAIN, right? And so it was based on the teachings by a very famous meditator whose name I just forgot. Sanyo. He wrote the book, The Mindfulness, and anyway, okay, I'm not going to mess this up. Recognize, huh?
Is it John Kabat-Zinn?
No. He's from, I think, Thailand. I'm getting so old, I can't remember anything. I wrote it down and I deleted it. Anyway, so somebody will remember. If you remember, shout it out. Tell me I'm an idiot. Okay. It's recognize, accept, inspect, and nurture. So this has actually been, taught in many different ways now by other teachers. So I'm using the presentation by Tara Brach of the Insight Meditation Society. So she teaches it as recognize, accept, inspect, and nurture. Okay, so the idea being that you recognize these emotions or feelings as they arise, you then accept them without trying to alter them. You inspect them by seeing how you hold these emotions, how do they affect you physically, as well as mentally. And then the last one is to practice self-compassion by then holding them in a non-harmful way, right? And so another way of thinking about this, though, is to use the last one, to the end, right? She uses it as a nurture. You could think of it as, I think, being in a more forceful way, right? Thinking of it as negating the feelings, unpleasant feelings, right? Negating them or neutralizing them, or I was going to say annihilating, but that starts with an A. So like annihilating those negative emotions and not allowing ourselves to fall victim to them, right? So depending on your situation and what the overall emotional context, right? It may be, in some cases, it's better to be very, very gentle, right? And I'm not a psychologist, so don't. But this is just what I'm saying. And in some cases, maybe it's better to be very gentle, to nurture those feelings, right? To practice self-compassion. That might be the right thing. And you are the person who knows in that situation what's best for you, right? Nobody sitting somewhere else can blah, 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 tell you what's right for you. You got to figure it out. But the alternate approach is to say, to be more stern, right? More forceful, and to say, no, I'm going to see these emotions and feelings for what they are, right? Well, we've been talking about how these emotions trap us in samsara, how they're temporary and superficial, right? They're adventitious stains on the innate purity of our minds, right? So in that sense, when you think of the Wheel of Sharp Weapons or some of these other mind training teachings, they're very, very much like they're powerful. They're unleashing that strong determination to get free of all of those emotions, right? So you can use the negation or whatever you want the N stands for. I think it could just be simply no. Okay, so recognize, accept, inspect, and then just say no. No, I am going to fight these inner enemies with all the courage and determination that I can muster, right? I'm not going to be their victim, right? It may be helpful to name, that inner critic that pops up from time to time and says, you can't do that. You're an idiot. You're full of it, right? So you can name that inner critic, or you can think of the inner critic as the maras, right? If you think of it in a more traditional Buddhist sense, right? The maras, those demons, those little monkeys that whisper in your brain, blah, 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 right? So you could give it a funny name, make this playful, right? Instead of scary or depressing, right? Give that inner critic a funny name, like whatever, like bozo or a goober or whatever. I was trying to think of something more hipster, but I couldn't think of anything because I'm so damn old. So, something that, as a millennial or Gen X or Gen Z, whatever, you guys think of a funny name, okay? So you don't take yourself so seriously, right? Okay, like there's Bozo again telling me that I should just shut up and go home, right? Whatever. So we can use this to recognize that others are also trapped in the same bad habits due to self-cherishing or self-centeredness. They have the same negative tendencies. They're also completely under the control, like of karma and the negative afflictions, right? Their minds are also, polluted by ignorance. And so, if we're all in the same boat, then wow, that's what gives us the ability to generate love and compassion and the aspiration to relieve them from their suffering. And so we can feel good knowing that we've already helped so many others, through our actions. And we've created tremendous amounts of merit as a result. So the slogan here is to be the change, right? That's really important. Our thoughts are our reality. And so we are very much in control of how we frame our experiences. And we can definitely slowly transform our thoughts and emotions. But, through meditation, these changes can occur. And it takes, of course, some time, right? Because you're rewiring your brain, right? You're creating new neural connections, new neural pathways. So we can't expect immediate results, but we should at least start, where we are and continue along this path. And then it's really important to join in fellowship, with others who are on the same path, and to be able to seek the inspiration and guidance of our spiritual teachers. Okay, any comments before we move on to topic of depth? David?
Yeah, I just want to say this idea that you just said about starting where you are prompts me to think of, there's a case to be made that when we feel anxious and when we feel worried, I'm going to put the word depression in there too, because that seems to also be the flip side of anxiety. Depression, anxiety, worry erupt when we want something to be other than what it is at that moment. And so having maybe, and this is aspirational, but having a selfless respect for reality, for that moment, appears to be, and again, this is all aspirational, but you still have to see it as a possibility other than falling prey to the worry, the anxiety, the depression, to see that there are other options other than just accepting that. Almost this thing about no, right? Like, I will not do that.
Right.
Right. Wanting something to be other than what it is at that moment results in the anxiety, the depression, the worry. So that starting where you are that you mentioned also needs to be redefined as I can be in a place other than where I am.
Right.
If I'm suffering. So I'm suffering unnecessarily and needlessly, what then do I need to do to help me, or to help another person get out of that trap, really?
Exactly.
And Kama Chodron talks about it being hooked. That you're being hooked at that moment, then with ego and self-cherishing. So it just made me think when you said start where you are, made me think of that we have control over where that are is.
Right. Yeah, well said.
I really resonate. I apologize for being late, by the way.
No problem.
But essentially, I'm fresh out of the hospital. a bit a few days ago. So
Oh,
something that's really resonated with me and a gift that was given to me in the hospital was Tara Brock's book, True Refuge. She
oh,
talks about many things in there. But what resonated to me was just the title, first off, Finding True Refuge, in a place where I felt I had no control over my situation. And as soon as I flipped the narrative and saw it as I have the ability to empower myself by finding my refuge in my tiny room, that it's still mine, but it's what I was grateful for. And it's when I tried my best to flip the perspective and wake up with a fresh perspective each morning. My situation was I was there for 2 weeks, but I've been in that situation before, and I'm learning to reduce and simplify the complicated thoughts I have as I deal with bipolar and depression as well, and many other things, PTSD. Simply the title, it was True Finding Refuge.
Finding
was
Refuge.
Something that resonated to me while I was there, and it's, I would say, what allowed me to free my mind and empower myself to wake up each morning for, I think, the 4 days prior to my discharge, which was trying to find my true refuge, which was through closing my eyes, through talking less, and relearning things I thought I knew. That's how I feel like I was able to empower myself. As I'm only 22, I'm learning that the things I may know or may have known a few years ago are things I'm trying to relearn. And the beauty of it is, I'll use the word jazz. Today I'm going to listen to a lot of jazz today. The spontaneity, perhaps the no lyrics, as I also make music and I wear hats, but I'm doing my best to reduce the thoughts and find my true refuge. And I'm trying to start here. And I think, as you were touching on, the change starts with us, and I'm wrestling with that concept myself. As far as thinking I've learned a lot, but also been entangled in the wisdom, if that makes sense. So I'm wrestling with these concepts now, and I'm finding that, to me, at this moment, the answer is simplicity, reduction, and true refuge at this moment. And also detaching from the ego is very difficult for me, as I am 22, but I believe that
I'm 64 and I'm still
That's why we're here.
I think it starts here. I think.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. And that's what's empowering, is because we know that we have the ability to in a sense, control our lives. The transformation stays is our responsibility, it's our choice, is our ability. That didn't come out quite right, but
I understood. Thank you.
okay. All right. So
was that I resonated with what you had said, and I tried to contribute, and I appreciate
Well, you did contribute big. Really great. Thanks a lot.
So moving on to this idea of death, right? So we'll start with a short quote, which I'm sure many of you have heard before. So the end of collection is dispersion. The end of rising is falling. The end of meeting is parting. And the end of birth is death. And so we can think of this life as a preparation for our next life. And if we've lived an ethical life, one of helping others, then there's nothing to fear. So it's like living or staying in an Airbnb for a number of years. Oh, nobody stays in an Airbnb for years. For a couple of nights, and then moving on to the next Airbnb, right? So the point just being that there's a sense of us as transmigratory beings, right? As droa, as migratory beings moving from house to house. It's like, driving around in a rental car. So a quote from the Dalai Lama, he said that the meditation on death is not to provoke an emotional panicky fear of death, which is of no benefit at all, but instead gives rise to a wise awareness of our mortality that leads us to set good priorities in life, to abandon harmful actions, and to live ethically and kindly. And for practitioners, who are very highly realized, then they look forward to the moment of death because due to their meditative experience, then an enlightenment, the enlightenment mind can actually be attained at the moment of death, time of death. And so we don't have a whole lot of time to cover this very, very complex and beautiful subject, but I'll just touch on a few points, and then we're going to wrap up with a short meditation on death. So the death process. The death process is explained in terms of an 8-stage series of steps, during which the 5 aggregates dissolve. And so starting with the body, the gross physical form and consciousness, and then finally going to the extremely subtle consciousnesses. And then at the final moment, then there's the extremely subtle consciousness in conjunction with the extremely subtle wind. They join together at the heart. And basically death occurs when they exit the body. So you may have heard that ordinary people can stay in a state of meditation, or the mind basically can stay with the body for maybe up to 3 days or so, and whereas yogis can continue meditating on this union of the clear light nature of the mind with the extremely subtle body for as long as they like. And then after that, that extremely subtle mind-body continuum then continues through the intermediate state, or the bardo, and then finally takes a new rebirth. So that being the basics of the death process itself, then what's more important perhaps is to prepare for death and to understand the teachings on how to live and die happily, right? Okay, so there are just a couple of points to go through here. Actually, there are 5 points. The first is the power of the white seed, which essentially means to cut all of your attachments, to give away all your possessions before you die. So this accumulates merit because you're engaging in the act of generosity, and it purifies negative karma. And so we should offer everything that we have, to our gurus, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and Sangha. And this is actually really, really important because, when you think to yourself, like for myself, when I think about at the moment of death, what am I going to, be the most worried about still? What's going to be on my mind? I know if my dog is still alive, I'm going to be worried about my dog. And so, you have to take steps now to make sure that everything is in good order so that you can leave, this life without having to worry about anything, right? The second is the power of intention, which is generating the wish to practice bodhicitta. So that means that from now until I achieve enlightenment, before I die, while I'm in the intermediate state and in all future lives, I will continue to practice bodhicitta. I will never allow myself to be separated from this mind of enlightenment, this mind that seeks to free all others from suffering. The next is the power of blaming the ego, which means giving up self-cherishing. So again, self-cherishing is the true enemy. It's what we seek to destroy, not some external enemy that's out there. So this is where the blame lies for every tiny bit of suffering we've ever had to experience. Without this inner enemy, then there is no outer enemy. We need to place the blame on this real cause of all our misery. All right. So it's not the external conditions that we currently blame. Instead, we need to really identify that the source of our unhappiness is self-cherishing. This is the true enemy. And by doing this, by destroying self-cherishing completely, then that allows us to permanently be free from suffering. Okay, so that's paraphrasing a quote from Lama Zopa Rinpoche in his book, How to Face Death Without Fear, an excellent book. Then the last two, the power of prayer, which is similar to the power of intention. So it's to pray to take on the suffering of all living beings and to generate bodhicitta. And then the last is the power of training, and that's to die in the lion posture like the Buddha on his right side, and to be able to transfer your consciousness to a pure land. So all of these 5 powers are things that we practice now, right? We don't wait until the moment of death, right, to do this. We should be practicing these right now. So renunciation, right, cutting attachment. The second is the power of intention, generating the wish to practice bodhicitta. The third is blaming the ego or giving up self-cherishing. And then the power of prayer, so at the aspiration to continue to be able to generate bodhicitta and to generate it, better and better and better. And then training in the methods that would allow you to transfer your consciousness at the moment of death. So there's actually, in the Lamrim teachings, there's a 9-point, what's known as a 9-point meditation on death. Again, that's something that you might want to practice, look it up yourself online and do that meditation whenever you have a chance. And what I found is a beautiful poem by the 7th Dalai Lama, and it's in the book Living in the Face of Death by Glenn Mullen. And I thought that by way of the meditation, sort of the shortcut version of the 9-point meditation on death. I mean, I think all the points are here, but it's a beautiful presentation, so I was going to do that. And we're sort of running out of time, so I think I'm going to do that. Unless, does anybody have a question or comment before I do this? Okay. Meditations on the ways of impermanence. To the Guru, my refuge and father, the recollection of whom dispels all sadness, I turn for spiritual guidance. Bless my mind with your transforming powers, that the thought of death may never evade me, that I may practice the holy Dharma perfectly. On the golden mountains far in the distance, rings of mist hang like belts on the meadows. Now seemingly solid, so soon they dissolve. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. In spring, the season of warmth and growth, the stalks of the crops were turquoise green. Now, autumn's end, the fields lie naked and parched. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. On each branch of the trees in my garden hang clusters of fruit, swelling and ripe. In the end, not one piece will remain. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. From behind the peaks of Mount Potala, the sun rose like an umbrella into the sky. Now it has gone, fallen behind the western ranges. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. They die old, they die young, day upon day. I am asked to throw their souls to a pure land, or to prophesy their conditions of rebirth. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. Gray clouds cover the sky, obscuring it. The first drops of rain are about to fall, to be scattered everywhere by the dark red wind. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. In the belly of the vast plateau below me, the campfires of visiting traders glow like stars. But tomorrow they depart, leaving only refuse. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. Warm summer days, the earth thronging with life, the minds of the people are lost in gaiety. Suddenly, the cold winter wind crashes them down. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. High above, turquoise dragons roared in harmony. Around me, cuckoo birds chattered sweetly. But times have changed. Where are they now? My mind turns to thoughts of my death. Dharma, the precious teachings of the awakened ones, is a medicine supreme, curing all the mind's ills. These days, many saints of old look down from Pure Lands. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. Hard it is to leave the mother who carried us, and hard to part from relatives and friends. Yet, as the years pass, our links with them corrode. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. A young man with teeth for the future, with plans for months and years ahead, died, leaving but scant traces. Where is he now? Gone. My mind turns to thoughts of my death. Buddha attained the glorious immortal Vajra body, yet he still enacted a death scene. This body of flesh, blood, and bone, covered in skin, like a bubble of water, is bound to perish. From its very birth, a child sees his parents slowly age, sees them each day come closer to the grave. How can you say to me, but I am still young? I warn you, there is no hope of hiding from death. Spirits were high with expectations this morning as the men discussed subduing enemies and protecting the land. Now, with nights coming, birds and dogs chew their corpses. Who believed that they themselves would die today? Look and ask among the people of your land For anyone, even 100 years old, you will be lucky to find even one. Do you not think your own death certain? If you look closely at and contemplate deeply the people and things that appear around you, you can see that everything is in constant flux. All becomes the teacher of impermanence. I remember this body when it was a child's, as it gradually took the form of a youth. Now its every limb is twisted and worn. It is my own body, yet it delights not even my own eyes. The mind itself is impermanent, constantly oscillating between feelings of pleasure, pain, and indifference, the respective fruits of positive, negative, and neutral karmas. Look where you will, at yourself or others. Life passes like a flash of lightning. When death's agents surround you, intent on murder, what do you think will happen to you? Relatives, friends, wealth, and property shine with splendor in the eyes of worldly people. Thus they bind themselves in shackles of attachment. This pathos, how will it end? Body lying flat on a last bed. Voices whispering a few last words. Mind watching a final memory glide past. When will that drama come for you? If you create nothing but negative karma, you will stand naked of instincts to benefit the hereafter. Where will you go after death? The mere thought of it makes you tremble. Therefore, myself and beings like me should leave behind meaningless ways and entrust ourselves to the gurus, mandala deities, and dakinis, requesting them to prepare us for death's road. In order to die well with the joy and confidence of being within the white rays of spiritual awareness, it is essential to begin readying yourself now. Familiarize yourself with the profound methods of the Sutra and Tantra lineages of transmission. By this song, may those like me, irreligious people, little better than savages, be caught in the flames of spiritual inspiration. May we evolve in spirit and attain knowledge and liberation. Okay. Any comments or last thoughts? Anything strike you about today's teaching? About the topics that we discussed? Anything that jumps out? Life and death are
By a single thread.
by a single breath?
Thread.
Thread.
Life and death are by a single thread.
True.
Where passes, we're both living on the same place.
Ah, yeah.
Anila,
Louisa?
hi. It's hard to even make a comment when the reminder is so potent. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Louisa. All right.
I was sort of taken by when we were setting that up for that meditation, the idea that first there's meeting and then there's parting. I mean, that happens on a daily basis, right? Even here, we've met and now we will part. To extrapolate that to living and then dying really the only difference is one in duration,
Right.
but it's the same in scope, right? The
Right.
living is the meeting part, the meeting of life every day, and then the parting is the death, but just 50 years, 60 years, 80 years, 100 years, in some cases 1 year, but
Yeah.
it's still in scope, it's very similar. So I take away this meeting and parting very much synonymous with living and dying.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I guess we're out of time. May we dedicate all of the merit, all of the goodwill from today's gathering. We dedicate all of this positive energy to help us understand ourselves better, so that we may radiate to everyone, around us, all of our good intentions, that by better understanding our own inner bozos, whatever you want to call it, that's the start to being able to then be of service to others. All right. So thank you again very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.